Interestingly, many people never heard about the B-19 bomber, as it was almost completely forgotten, though it was a real star when it appeared, the biggest bomber and even the biggest plane of its time. It was almost double the size of a B-17, and only the giant Convair B-36 surpassed it. When it was unveiled in 1941, it caused a media craze, and thousands showed up for its maiden flight. It was the most sophisticated and biggest aircraft ever built. When we say the B-19 was big, it was actually huge. All of its dimensions were astounding at the time. A wingspan of 212 feet and a length of 132 feet, compare that to the B-17's wingspan of 103 feet and the length of 74 feet, and we will actually have some clue how big the B-19 actually was. The cockpit, or rather crew compartment, had 8 seats and 6 bunks. The wings were so big they had tunnels in them for the flight engineers. It required a crew of 16 men, could carry 18,700 pounds of bomb load, which could be increased to 36,000 pounds, including the external racks. The combat range was an astounding 5,200 miles. The bomber's defensive armament was not less impressive. It featured 5 50 caliber machine gun positions, 6 30 caliber machine gun positions, and even 2 37mm autocannons. The engineers had to use many innovative features because of the size of the plane. All the control surfaces were hydraulically operated, as their sheer size made it impossible to use the conventional control wires. It used a tricycle landing gear, which was unusual at that time even on smaller aircraft, but it was unheard of on a plane of this size. Given the plane's size and weight, the landing gear had to be enormous as well. The main wheels were the biggest ever made, with a diameter of 8 feet. The oil tanks for the engines alone held almost 400 gallons of oil. The story of the plane starts in February 1935, when the US Army Air Corps started Project D, a secret project to push the limits of engineering on long-range heavy bombers. The project was discussed with Douglas and Sikorsky. Douglas was interested in the project, and in June their plans were laid out. In October the same year, Douglas was given a formal contract to develop the plane. Their proposed aircraft dwarfed anything that was built before, and for some time after. At that time they didn't know how much they underestimated the task of building such an enormous plane though. Their plan was to finish the design in 1936 and create the first prototype by 1938, but in reality the plane's first flight actually only took place in 1941, a full 3 years after it was planned. The work on the plane, at that time known as XB-2, Experimental Bomber Long Range 2, took much longer than they anticipated. The sheer size of the aircraft was problematic enough, but the lack of funding and the change of plans during development further delayed the project. The plane originally was planned to use the Ellison V3420 engines producing 2,600 horsepower each. These were basically two 12-cylinder V1710 engines mated together. But the development of the engine was lagging behind and was plagued with problems, so the aircraft had to be redesigned. They had to use the readily available but less powerful Wright R3350 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each. The whole design of the plane was very troublesome for Douglas. It cost much more than it was originally planned. The government spent around $1.4 million on it, but Douglas had to spend further $4 million during the development. The plane was much heavier than it should have been, and with the Wright engines, very underpowered. Originally it meant to be a plane that pushes the limits, but because of its long development, the aviation technology actually surpassed it. The Douglas company officially asked for the termination of the project. They argued that the plane is already obsolete and it's not worth finishing it as it was a dead end, but the Air Corps denied the request and pushed Douglas to finish the prototype. Eventually the XB-19 was completed in May 1941. The fact they had to partly demolish the hangar it was built in to get the plane out gives us an indication how big it actually was. It made its maiden flight on 27 June the same year. The plane was so heavy, weighing almost 80 tons, that it broke the surface of the runway in some places, and the engineers of Douglas had to use some planks to free it. The 55-minute maiden flight went smoothly without an incident though. The plane meant to be top secret, but as gigantic as it was, they couldn't keep it under wraps, and several thousand people gathered to see its first flight. It was a great propaganda asset, as it appeared on every major newspaper and other media as the biggest bomber ever built. It even got a nickname, the Guardian of the Hemisphere. The Air Corps accepted the XB-19 in October 1941, and it underwent extensive testing for 18 months, so much so that they started referring to it as a flying laboratory. During that time, after the Pearl Harbor attack, it was repainted in olive green and its weaponry was armed and tested as the US Air Corps was in high alert. The public was kept away from further test flights as secrecy became more important in wartime, though because of the enormous size of the aircraft, this was almost impossible. Sadly, the B-19 was pushed aside after the testing and never went on to be used as a bomber it was designed to be. It was modified to cargo aircraft role, though it wasn't actually used as one. Eventually it was rebuilt with the originally planned Ellison V-3420 engines and redesignated as XB-19A model. After being rebuilt with its new engines, it served as a testbed for them, as the Air Corps planned to use those on the B-29 as well. The data collected on the XB-19A proved to be valuable in the development of the B-29 and the B-36. Though the new engines improved the performance of the aircraft and finally it could fly as it meant to, problems with the Ellison engines meant they didn't go to mass production. The XB-19A was also used to test different equipment at high altitudes. After its role as a flying laboratory was concluded, the biggest bomber of World War II sadly just quietly disappeared. It was modified to cargo aircraft role, though it wasn't actually used as one. After moving from one airfield to another, finally it sat in storage at Wright Field, until 1949 when it finally was scrapped. The biggest bomber of World War II sadly was too big for its own good and ahead of its time, and it was forgotten. The only surviving parts of the plane are two giant wheels. One can be seen in Hill Aerospace Museum, Utah, the other in the National Air Museum of US Air Force in Ohio. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.